Okay, grade 8. My apologies for having this up at 5:32. I guess that's when I'm recording it. I meant to have it up before 5, but I forgot, so I came back to school to do it just for you guys. That's how good a teacher I am. All right, so this is a review of your Chapter 10 final on solving linear equations or algebra. So as you go through it, make sure your corrections, you have a separate piece of paper, write down what exactly it was you did, and also make a note of what it was you should have done by my explanation in this particular video. Be very detailed, or as detailed as you can, to make sure that I understand what you understand what your mistake was. First question is true or false. It says 5x equals 5 plus x. The answer for that is false. But for all of the true false, you need to have an explanation. Now 5x means 5 times x, and 5 plus x equals addition. So you just had to differentiate that 5x means multiplication and 5 plus x means addition. So they're different operations altogether. Question 2, in the equation x minus 1. So I'm going to draw an x and a minus 1 equals a negative 1. The coefficient is 1. Now remember, a coefficient is a multiplier to the variable. So really, when we're talking about coefficients, we're talking about a 1x. And if I think about how many x's do I have, I just have one of them. So 1x is the same thing as x. We just don't write coefficients of 1. We assume that if it's an x, we know there's just one of them. Same thing with a negative x. When it's a negative 1x, that is the same thing as just a negative x. So just be sure that a 1x and an x are the same thing, and a negative 1x and a negative x are the same thing. So the answer to this one is true. They are the same thing. Question 3, when you expand the equation 4 bracket x minus 3, or 4 times x minus 3, the constant would be negative 12. So remember, when you expand, you're using distributive property. 4 times x would be 4x, and 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. So this equation here would be the same thing, and when we look at this, we see that the constant is negative 12, excuse me. So the answer is true. That is the constant. In question 4, the value of x in the equation negative 2x minus 3 equals 9. The value of x will be negative. So what we have to do here is actually just solve for x. Okay, we're going to put, we're going to add 3 to both sides to get rid of the constant. Negative 2x equals negative 6. And we're going to divide both sides by negative 2. And x will equal a positive 3, because a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So the answer for this is, the answer for this is false. It's going to be a positive. And your last question in the true-false is the coefficient of the expression x divided by 5, or x over 5 plus 5 equals 5. And the answer for this is false. The coefficient is not 5, and here's why. If we think about what this is, and if I was to draw it, there's your x tile. And there would be a fifth of x. So a fifth of x is really this one, which is still this one. Or if we want to think of a fifth of the decimal, it's actually 20% of an x, or 2/10 of an x. So these three things are always the same thing, which means the coefficient is not 5, but rather 0.2, or a fifth. That's a 5. Questions 6, 7, and 8, and 9 are all using inspection to solve. So what I wanted for this one, a lot of people had these wrong. It says, write the question in word form. What would you be asking yourself if you were to solve this? And the question is negative 10 times what number, or times a number, is 20. So negative 10 times what number is 20? Question. And the answer, negative 10 times negative 2 is a positive 20. So that's what we'd expect to see for that. Negative times what number is 20? Answer, negative 2. In question 7, 9 subtract what number is negative 1? That's your question. 9 subtract what number is negative 1? And the answer, well, 9 take away 8 is 1. 9 take away 9 is 0. And 9 take away 10 is negative 1. So the answer is x equals 10. Question 8, what number divided by negative 2 is negative 4? That's your question. Your answer, x equals, well, 8 divided by 4 is 2. Is it a positive 8 or a negative 8? It's a positive 8 divided by a negative 2 equals a negative 4. So your answer is x equals 8. And your last question, 2 times what number? Then subtract 10 from. Then subtract, that should be subtract. I didn't write that in. Subtract 10 is 10. So what number do you multiply by 2? So if I covered this up, if I just ignored that, what number take away 10 is 10? The answer is 20. So this has to have a value of 20 because 20 take away 10 is 10. So 2 times what number is 20? X must equal 10 because 2 times 10 is 20. For questions 10 and 11, you use modeling to solve. So here we have x and x and x minus 2 is equal to negative 8. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of my constant by adding 2 to both sides. Remember, whatever you do to one side, you have to do the other. Now we have those 0 pairs. So we have 3 x's left over here and 6 negatives left over here. So each of these x's, if I divide them onto scales, divide them into 3 groups, each of those x's would weigh 2 negatives. If 6 of those x's weigh negative 6, then 2 would weigh, so x would equal negative 2. In the next question, we have a fifth of x. So again, just like the one we just did before in the true-false, there's a fifth of x minus 1 equals 2. So the first thing I do is get rid of my constant by adding 1 to both sides. This is a 0 pair. There are no 0 pairs over here, just 3. So we have a fifth of x equals 3. Now, how many fifths of x do I need to make, I'm going to ungroup this for a second. Grouping, I'm going to ungroup, then I'm going to take this. Oh, did I do that right? No, I didn't. Hang on. So when we look at this, how many of these fifths of x do I need to make a full x? I would need 5 of them. So I'm going to multiply this side by 5 because those 5 put together will make a full x. And if I multiply that side by 5, then from a modeling perspective, I have to multiply this side by 5. And all of these are going to make a full x. All right, so 5 fifths will make make 1, and I'm too lazy to do it, so that's going to be 15. So therefore, a full x has a value of 15. In the next question, simply use opposite operation to solve. We just have a constant. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides to get rid of it. X will equal negative 1. In the next question, my constant's negative 10, and we can see it better if we actually drew it. So if I drew negative 10 plus an x equals 2, I would know that I'm going to have to add 10 of these things to this side. All right, add 10 of them. So I'm going to add 10 to this side and add 10 to this side. I'm going to be left with x by itself equals 12. In the next question, negative 6 times the value of x equals negative 6. So I'm going to get rid of the coefficient by dividing by the coefficient. I get x equals, well, negative 6 divided by itself is going to be a positive 1. The next question, which is not 13, I think it's 15 on your sheet. X divided by negative 10 equals negative 20. So I'm going to get rid of the divided by negative 10 by multiplying both sides by negative 10. And x will equal the product, or the multiplication of 20 and 10, which is 200. And a negative multiplied by a negative is going to be a positive. So x equals positive 200. And question 14, we start getting into our two-step equations. Now, I was very generous. If you got the first step right and the second step wrong and the answer wrong, you still got 1 point out of 2, which is more than generous because you should be able to do all the steps in a two-step equation. But the first thing you get rid of is your constant. It's the easiest thing to get rid of. Negative 3x equals 24. And a lot of people that mess this up didn't divide by negative 3, they divided by positive 3, but divide by whatever the coefficient is, and x will equal negative 8. In question 15, get rid of your constant first by subtracting 5 from both sides. A negative half of x equals the sum of these two. 5 negatives and 2 positives is 3 negatives. Multiply both sides by negative 2. And x will equal a positive 6, because a negative, again, multiplied by a negative is a positive. Here we have another two-step equation, and this is the other side. So what I've done is I switched the variable, and the constant is actually your first term, which is not a common thing. So the first thing we're going to do is add 3 to both sides to get rid of your constant. I get 4x equals the sum of 3 and negative 1, which is 2. And a lot of people didn't do their division right. I'm going to divide both sides by 4, but 2 divided by 4, in lowest terms if we think about fraction, is 1 over 2. And most people know that 1 over 2 as a decimal is 0.5. But if you didn't know that, you could take your calculator and go, what is 2 divided by 4? And it's still going to tell you it's decimal 5, right? So x equals decimal 5. Next question, your constant is 8. Some people think because the negative sign is here that well, that's close enough to being a negative 8, but it's not. It's a positive 8. So positive 8, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides to get rid of that positive 8. And over here, a positive 12 and a negative 8 make a positive 4. And this here is this here. Now this is a negative half of x, which can be expressed this way, which can be expressed this way. All 3 are the same. And when you're given the opportunity with all 3, put your negative sign in your denominator, because on my very next step here, when I multiply both sides to get rid of that divided by, I get rid of it, I get a positive x. So it's just an easier way to kind of simplify your life when you're isolating variables. And for whatever question this is, x equals negative 8. For question 18, we have a distributive property. So there's 2 ways you could solve it, and I'll write it twice. The first way is to divide both sides. Instead of saying 4 groups of x minus 4 equals negative 20, then if you divide that by 4, instead of having 4 groups of x minus 4, you'll have 1 group of x minus 4 equals negative 5, because negative 20 divided by 4 is negative 5. Then you simply have to add 4 to both sides to get rid of your constant, and the value of x will be the sum of positive 5 or negative 5 and positive 4, which is negative 1. And question 19, which is your last question, says, what is the perimeter of this rectangle? Solve for x using algebra, and then determine the perimeter. So area equals length times width, or width times length. It doesn't matter which way you do it, because multiplication, you still get the same answer. Since we know this is the formula, and 117 is the area, the length and the width, we'll pretend this is the length, and we'll pretend this is the width, because the length is one number, and the width is a binomial, and it makes it much easier, because I have to set it up, or at least you should know you had to set it up using distributive property. So the area equals the length multiplied by the width. Now, since we have it set up this way, we now have to utilize distributive property. So 9 times x plus 8 will be 9 x's and 9 eighths, which is 72. So the area equals 9x plus 72. And then we just isolate the variable by subtracting 72 from both sides. I get 9x equals 28 plus 17 is 38.45. Divide both sides by 9. And x equals 5. Okay, but we're not done yet, because all we know now is that x is 5. So if I take my marker and I erase that x, and instead of that x, put a 5, then I now know the length of that rectangle is 8 plus 5, or 5 plus 8, which is 13. So now I know my dimensions. So the perimeter of a rectangle is 2 lengths and 2 widths. So since the length is 13, then 2 of those 13s and 2 of those widths will be the distance around the whole thing. So the 2 lengths will be 26, the 2 widths will be 18. That will end up being 44. And since we're dealing with distance, not area, the perimeter equals 44 meters.